So unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard that the FDA recently rejected MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for PTSD. MDMA is also known as ecstasy or Molly and is currently a Schedule I drug in the United States of America. And in this video, I'm going to kind of just summarize what the FDA said, why they rejected it, discuss the implications of this for future psychedelic research, and overall give you my thoughts on the matter. With that being said, hint the intro, eh? What the fuck is going on, YouTube? It's Ashcon, aka Dropped Out Beats, back again with another Addiction Neuroscientist Reacts video. But, as you heard from the intro, we're not reacting to the typical interviews of people talking about their experience with drug use today. Instead, we're going to be reacting to the news that the FDA, as of a couple of weeks ago, officially rejected MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for PTSD. Now, you may be seeing my shirt and thinking that I'm a little bit biased, but while I am a little bit biased towards the positive effects of psychedelics, I'm totally not surprised by this FDA rejection. I think it will actually be good in the long run because it will help us get to the question of, are psychedelics good for mental health or are they not? Are they neutral? What's the deal going on here? And you may be wondering, what are my thoughts on the psychotherapy side of things? I'm kind of mixed on the psychotherapy side of things. We're going to talk about that as we get into this video because the FDA is also a little concerned about the psychotherapy side of things. And so, with that being said, what we first want to look at in this video is just an overall review of the different phases of the clinical trials and how to get a drug approved by the FDA and bring a drug to market. So, with that being said, let me take my big, ugly head off the screen here. We first start with preclinical trials, as you can see here. Am I going to be able to talk in this video? I don't know. We'll see how this one goes. This is like take 200,000. Let's keep going. Anyway, so preclinical trials start with about 10,000 compounds. Can you believe that shit? They make test about 10,000 drugs to determine, could this drug possibly be a treatment for the ailment that we are looking at? In this case, could MDMA possibly be a treatment for PTSD? What the hell could possibly be a treatment for PTSD? So they search through 10,000 drugs. They come up with about 250 that they want to further take through preclinical development. This means animal testing to make sure that the drug is safe, start to determine some abuse liability, all of that preclinical data that they need to gather to determine that the drug is safe to go into humans. Or to give to humans, rather, not to go into humans. It sounds like I'm like fucking sticking drugs up people's butts. But anyway, once a drug has been deemed that it is safe to be given to humans, not go into humans, we're going to go into a phase 1 trial of a drug. Now, phase 1 trial is just to determine that the drug is safe in humans and only involves about 20 to 80 participants. I'll link this blog down below. It's a great blog post from OncoBytes from 2019, a few years old, and it's a oncology-based blog, but doesn't matter. It's a good summary of how clinical trials work. So, the purpose of phase 1 is to determine if the drug is safe. In most fields, phase 1 studies are done in healthy patients. However, oncology phase 1 studies are done in cancer patients because it would be unethical to treat healthy patients with drugs known to cause severe side effects, which drugs that kill cancer cells cause severe side effects. So, of course, we're not going to give those to a healthy patient. Once that drug has gone through phase 1 and been determined that it is safe, it can now move on to phase 2. Phase 2 involves about 100 to 300 participants and is the first time we're going to start testing the efficacy of the drug, being, does the drug actually treat the ailment we are trying to help, right? Let's go back to our blog, see what OncoBytes has to say, So phase 2 is the first time the FDA considers the efficacy of the drug. Safety will be assessed as well. A larger number, hundreds of homogeneous patients, are enrolled to increase the odds for success. At the end of phase 2 studies, a CSR is submitted to the FDA. So let's Google, what is a CSR? I should know this because, nope. Clinical trials. Let's learn something together. Clinical study report. Yep, I knew I should have known that. So they submit the clinical study report, basically the findings, to the FDA just to tell them what's going on. Hey, can we move to phase 3 studies, basically, right? In this case, if you pass phase 2 with your 1 to 300 patients, you submit your results to the FDA. They say you're good to go. Go to phase 3. You're going to enroll about 1 to 3,000 participants. Now, let's go back to our blog. If the drug is determined to be safe and efficacious, it will move to phase 3 studies. In this phase, thousands of heterogeneous patients are tested to ensure that no side effects were missed in the first 2 studies. The large number of patients also allows the FDA to better determine the efficacy of the drug. Usually the FDA requires at least 2 separate phase 3 studies. If they are successful, the sponsor will complete all clinical trial data into a new drug application. This will be submitted to the FDA, who will then decide if there is enough information to approve the drug. This can take between 10 months to 1 year. And so that is where Lykos, who was sponsoring the MDMA-Assisted Psychotherapy, submitted their new drug application, and they were rejected. Take a sip of my water. Gotta stay hydrated, you feel me? And so, I wanted to look at this BBC article, kind of going into detail, talking about why they did end up rejecting MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And so, try to move it over here so you guys can read it with me. But this states that some 13 million Americans struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's only a fraction of patients that the current therapies work for. This would have been the first new therapy for PTSD in 25 years. So that is why a lot of people were clamoring for not only a new drug, but hopefully MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And so this BBC article states that ahead of the meeting, FDA approval of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD seemed likely. An assistant professor, Sandeep Nayak, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, an assistant professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, who investigates psychedelics as a treatment for substance use and mood disorders. About 2/3 of people who received 3 sessions of MDMA and talk therapy no longer qualified for PTSD diagnosis at the end of 2 phase 3 clinical trials. And so another researcher goes on to say it's an outcome that almost double that of existing medications. And what's more, the treatment led to durable improvements in these patients that lasted at least 6 months. Another researcher states that about half of the people who enroll in the current gold standard of PTSD treatments drop out, which is absurd, states Lori Sutton, a psychiatrist and retired brigadier general in the U.S. Army. So respect to Dr. Lori Sutton. Dr. Rachel Yehuda adds, even if there are risks, we've got to figure this out because we cannot not let this treatment be available. Without it, we're just leaving too many people in suffering that they don't need to be in, and it is not right. So basically, in a 9-hour hearing, this was from the recent committee that stated that they do not recommend MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. It was a 9-2 vote where 9 members voted that the drug did not show that it was safe and effective for the treatment of PTSD and did not outweigh the benefits did not outweigh the risks. But so let's look into some of the further problems here. Critics point out that just one member of the FDA advisory committee had expertise in psychedelics and argue that the committee may have misunderstood aspects of the treatment. There are so many different issues and angles to this dumpster fire, which I totally agree this is a dumpster fire, which indeed I would say it is. I agree. The biggest issue is that the advisory committee members really showed a kind of astounding lack of knowledge about the subject matter. And this is from Dr. Franklin King from Mass General Hospital out of Harvard Medical School. The panel spent some time, for example, debating whether it should be voted on efficacy and safety of the drug, in quotes, or the drug-assisted therapy model that the clinical trials investigated. Excluding the therapy from the efficacy evaluation doesn't make sense scientifically speaking, says Eduardo Schinberg, director of the Instituto Faneros, a psychedelic research and therapy group in Sao Paulo, who has conducted research into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for victims of sexual abuse and, with severe PTSD. And so the BBC actually contacted 11 committee members asking if they had a response. One member, Kim Witzak, a drug safety advocate and the committee's consumer representative, replied, "This is a new territory and must be treaded carefully," she wrote in an email. "The time to be cautious is now, not afterwards." And so I think it should be noted that, on one side of the panel, we have psychedelic research advocates basically saying like, hey, we desperately need a new PTSD treatment. And on the other hand, we have drug safety advocates saying like, hey, we need to be cautious. And so the committee's vote is non-binding, but it could influence the FDA's decision to approve the treatment, which they rejected. And so one of the main problems is the blinding problem, the blinding problem, excuse me. And so the blinding problem is basically just that everybody or most people that get MDMA correctly guess that they got MDMA, while people who receive the placebo also guess that they correctly took the placebo. So it states here that a primary issue was functional unblinding, or the ability of participants to tell whether they received a placebo or active drug, which has the potential to influence the outcome captured in the data. More than 90% of people in the MDMA group and 75% in the placebo group correctly guessed their treatment arm in the second phase 3 trial. So yeah, like I was saying, most people are able to determine, hey, I am on a drug called ecstasy, not on nothing, or not on a drug that doesn't make me feel what the term ecstasy implies I should feel. Let me see if there's anything else here that we really need to talk about. So they start discussing the difference between an active placebo and non-active placebo. This was one of the main issues. Another issue the committee raised was the fact that 40% of participants had taken MDMA before, mostly on the order of 2 to 4 times in the past 10 years. Emerson says the committee expressed concerns that people who had sought out illegal drugs before had a more favorable view going into the trial, which could introduce positive bias. There was another comment made. I think this is from an article here in Slate. Let me find where they talk about it here. Yeah, so in a Slate article titled, "No, the FDA didn't reject MDMA therapy because of Big Pharma. It was because of shoddy science." I pretty much agree with this headline, although it's really not that simple. This type of rhetoric and action can also lead to biased outcomes. Facilitators can consciously or unconsciously convey to participants that the drug is likely to work, which can alter a participant's response to the drug. Again, this is especially true of MDMA, which is well documented to enhance suggestibility. And so basically what they're saying is that if a therapist believes that the drug is going to work and continues to suggest to the patient like, hey, this drug is going to work, the patient is more likely to report positive findings. They also went on to state that they found that when reporting findings, participants were more likely to report positive findings because they wanted to see that the drug was going to get approved. And so all of this really kind of convolutes the idea of whether or not MDMA is useful for PTSD, right? And so ultimately, we have to somehow make this not a political movement, and I feel bad saying that because psychedelics and drugs in general have been so demonized that to do anything like this where we're trying to say like, hey, drugs aren't this terrible thing, they're actually, they might have some benefits, is going to get extreme pushback. And so I think Lykos, quite frankly, was stupid to put 40% of participants that report have had MDMA before. I mean, come on. You should have known that was going to be a 2 thumbs down from the FDA, especially with a Schedule 1 substance like MDMA that's called ecstasy. That is just asking for drug safety advocates to blow how harmful a particular drug is out of the water, because now they're saying, oh my God, just like this person is saying, oh my God, they've taken MDMA outside of this clinical setting. They're probably going to do it again because now we gave it to them in the clinical setting. Like, what's going to stop them from taking it outside the clinical setting? Which is why we should just, somehow decriminalize and legalize all drugs anyway, but that's not what we're talking about today. To kind of give you my opinion, as you can tell, I'm biased towards psychedelic drugs being a net benefit. Do I think that this was the best way of going about things through Lykos? Absolutely not. I actually had the privilege of attending Psychedelic Science last year in Denver, and I gotta say, my skepticism of MAPS and everything Rick Doblin has currently worked for went up tenfold when I saw him walk out in an all-white, cult leader type suit. I don't trust that guy anymore after I saw that, and to see the crowd erupt for their particular cult leader, I was just kind of standing there in the back like, oh, I feel kind of dirty. Like, am I at the cult place? Like, you guys are in the cult? I don't know if I want to be in the cult. This is kind of weird. And so I think that's obviously affecting the clinical trials. It's obviously affecting how the FDA is reviewing the data. And so I don't think anyone is, totally wrong here. I don't think the data is totally garbage. Unfortunately, we did have a case of sexual assault in Canada that is affecting the studies. And so all of these pieces of bad science is really what they are. It's little pieces of bad science that have built up to a bad study that have now caused all 3 papers to be retracted by Psychopharmacology, I believe the journal was. So all 3 of the papers that detailed the clinical trial reports of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD were unfortunately retracted by Psychopharmacology. And so, like I said, this whole thing is a disaster, but I think it does open up what is going to become the actual war between Big Pharma and the psychedelic science research companies. And that is going to be the war between psychedelics versus non-psychedelic drugs. What the fuck are you talking about, Ashkan? Well, if you've been in the research community, you've probably heard that there is a class of drugs that are being developed called non-psychedelic psychedelics. They are now being rebranded as neuroplastogens, particularly by a company called Lykos Therapeutics, where you can see here they're starting to get a compound DLX-001 into phase 1 of clinical trials where they are able to give the drugs to humans. Now these are, this is Lykos Therapeutics, which you can see is rapidly developing neuroplastogens to help advance the next generation of neurological treatment. It looks like they have their first drug, DLX-001, in phase 1 trials for major depressive disorder. If we remember, the phase 1 trials were just the giving drugs to humans to make sure that they are safe. And so the current war that I think that is going to happen is going to be between the neuroplastogens, which are drugs based on psychedelics, meaning they work in the brain similar to psychedelics, but they don't cause any psychedelic trip. So none of the, fun stuff. Only serious science stuff happening. Whereas psychoplastogens would be more of the psychedelics, meaning they expand your mind and your brain. Neuroplastogens are thought to only expand your brain, create new brain cell connections, whereas psychoplastogens are thought to do that and lead to cognitive distortions and hallucinations and all that shit. So I might make a more video essay type video on the idea of neuroplastogens versus psychoplastogens in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in. Please subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get these numbers up. Drop a comment down below if you have a question for me or if you have a good, interesting opinion on what's going on with the psychedelic research movement. I don't think this spells the end for the psychedelic research movement, but like I'm saying, I do think it gives time for the neuroplastogens to kind of bubble up to the surface and get to those phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. Even though we do see psilocybin and LSD trials happening as well, which I should cover in a different video. But yeah, I think we're going to start to really see the war between kind of more of the drug safety advocacy psychiatry movement. That's going to be on one side, and then we're going to have the psychedelic research movement on the other side. And they're really going to, in the next 10 years, that's going to be the clash. Neuroplastogens versus psychoplastogens. Tell me what you think is going to win down below. Drugs that don't cause a psychedelic trip, but work similarly in your brain to psychedelics? Or are we going to go the psychedelic route and you're going to have to experience a psychedelic trip? You probably already know my thoughts of where I lean. So, yeah. Hit the like, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate all of you beautiful degenerates. That being said, peace out.